I always like to start with a bit of an exercise for the audience. And I'm calculating here we must have at least 1,000 years of math in this room. So one of the big reasons, the reason I do what I do, I'm in a hotel room about 275 days a year. I never charge for anything I do, and I go all over. You'll see I go all over. And there are two reasons I do it. I want to start with the first. So I spent my career initially with a startup company that was doing fast math chips that sort of were groundwork for the digital revolution, and then 25 years in venture capital. And there were things I saw in that were exhilarating, some really positive things, great changes, driven entrepreneurs, amazing things. But one day I had lunch with a guy, true story, and he was really excited because they had just made an investment in a company called Harvest Automation. And he said, this company is going to be incredible. Their goal is to put out of work every minimum wage worker in landscape nurseries across the country. So these are people that move plants, okay? And they had a robotic solution. And I went home and I said, wow. You know, I mean, I'm not sure I'd get excited about investing in a company that was going to put minimum wage workers out of a job. And I started thinking about this. And I've lived and breathed most of this trajectory. And so here's the issue. I didn't bring my smartphone down here, so I can't hold it up. But for 50 years, technology, price performance of computational power has been on exponential growth curve. And it has been on that year in and year out for 50 years. And there are a lot of smart people that think not only is it not going to plateau, it could actually accelerate. But so here's our challenge. It's doubled in price performance every 2 years, okay? So where will it be in 10? So somebody that's sure of the answer, I want you to hold up your hand and tell me where it will be in 10. So this is very typical. You know, I ask this question of audiences all the time because think of all the math we've taken in this room, right? We've all, I'm sure, taken pre-calculus. We've all taken exponential functions. So, but this is, nobody's gotten this answer yet. And it goes like this. In 2 years, it's 2x. In 4 years, it's 4x. So far, normal. In 6 years, 8x. In 8 years, 16x. In 10 years, 32x. To put that in perspective, think of all this disruption we've seen in our life in the last 10 years. It was only a little over 10 years ago that the first smartphone came out. All that disruption. That accelerating curve says there'll be 30 times, 32 times as much disruption in the next 10 years as the last 10 years. Okay, if it's 32x in 10 years, where is it in 20 years? Anybody know that answer and just want to say it? 20 years. See, it's interesting. I mean, I think this is fascinating, right? So it's 32 times 32, more than 1,000 times the disruption. And so my team made this little video, and if I don't blow this, we'll be able to see it. But to give you a sense of where we're headed, what the world's going to look like in the future. anyway, I can talk as it's going, but we did this short video. It got huge social media traction, and it just shows category after category and all the solutions that are already being rolled out. And so each of these categories, by the way, employs somewhere between 3 and 10 million people. And so you look at this and you say, so far, it's not uncomfortable for us because so far these are more, menial, truck drivers, retail clerks, things like that. We get into more interesting categories in a second. But if Amazon already has a store, retail, which requires no employees, where will we be in 10 years? If everybody who drives, there's 6.5 million people in the country that drive vehicles, where will they be in 10 years? Construction, 3D printed houses. And you just look, McDonald's, their stock price surged when they announced they have a new employee list, which is actually going to be better food, more personalized, cleaner, and that's on its way. And so, anyway, this is really, to me, the future our kids are going to be in. By the time a kindergarten kid is out of school, there will not be a single routine job left in the economy. So you think about all the people that just sort of roll out of school and plug in with something like those landscape nurseries where people are moving plants around. Those jobs are going away. And you can't put pause on the advance of technology. It's inevitable. And so that, to me, was a sobering realization. The second thing that happened, I want to tell a story. My kids are now 21 and 19. So when they were in middle school, I got this note from the school, which initially I thought this is great news. They sent a note to me at home, to all the parents, and they said, come to a brown bag lunch for parents. We have a brand new program that we're launching to teach your children important life skills. And I got it. I said, that's great. And then I started to think, I said, it struck me as odd, right? This is a new program to teach important life skills. I mean, I kind of thought that's what school was about, right? That school was about preparing kids for life. And yet this is a new program. I said, okay, well, I'm going to go. But to prepare for it, I started to make my own list of what I felt kids would need in a world where all of those routine jobs are gone. And that is a world I lived and breathed in venture capital. So I have a pretty good handle on what types of skill sets, what types of mindsets, what types of competencies will equip a kid to do well in a world that's just full of dynamic innovation, change, things going a million miles an hour. So I made my little list. So I go to the lunch, and it wasn't a waste of time, but it was, perhaps you're not surprised when I tell you what it was, where they said monthly seminars or monthly assemblies, and to teach your kid not to drive fast, we'll show videos of car crashes. And to teach your kid not to smoke, we'll show videos or still images of tar-infested lungs and throat cancer and everything. And I didn't come away from that saying that's a bad idea, but I said that doesn't seem like it's really getting at the essence of what life skills are. And the thing I then did is I switched gears. So I would say, a very typical parent before that, which is I was on my kids, and I cared about two things. I cared about how much homework they were doing. Are you buckling down? Are you getting it done? And I cared about their grades. And I think that showed I was a very responsible parent. And so, boom. But then I said, after that seminar, after that lunch, I just made my little list. And I said, things that I thought, I was going to look at all their assignments. And I was able to sort of dig in a little bit, try not to get too much in their space on this, but homework assignments and tests, and I started to map them. And I said, which of these things they're doing will really help them in life, and which ones strike me as irrelevant? And I had a fairly loose definition. I was actually trying to look for things that would help, but irrelevant for me was, if they got really good at it, I knew as an adult they'd never use it. And I have, Lonnie didn't go into it, but I do. For instance, when it comes to science and math, I have a Ph.D. in engineering from Stanford, so I've lived and breathed a lot of this, so I have a decent understanding of this stuff. And what was Disconcerting, I'd say disconcerting, is that the list of irrelevant just filled up so quickly. And I just said, my gosh, all this stuff they're doing, I can't make a case that this is going to be of use to them later in life. And that sounds shocking, but I would encourage you to look at grade 7 through 12 curriculum and put it to the same test. Is this something you use? Is this something important to you as an adult? Now, they did a little bit of writing. Kids actually, in a lot of schools, don't do that much writing, and certainly writing is important. They were reading some books. Certainly that's important. So it's not that it was empty, the list of what's important, but the list of things that I could articulate that really, really helped them later in life was very difficult to come up with things that were helping. That wasn't great, but the thing that really changed my mind about it was I started to notice things that I said would impair them in life. And what would be examples of like that? Like if they went to their teacher and said, could I do something unusual? The school would say, that would be a bad precedent, you can't do it. If they tried something out of the blue or out of the ordinary, that was discouraged. I'd ask, how often do you get to ask questions in class? That was not really, at that school, particularly encouraged. And I started to realize that they're being coached, they're being advised, they're being rewarded for doing, and this sounds harsh, and I understand it, but bear with me, is that there were 4 things that were going to be really valuable to them in school. Now, this was a school, but I've since visited a lot of schools, but in their school, that school, what was really going to be important was memorizing content, replicating low-level procedures, writing formulaically, and following instructions. So those 4 things. I'll say them again because they're important. So memorizing content, replicating low-level procedures, writing formulaically, following instructions. Now, what scares me with an innovation background is that's exactly what machine intelligence is good at. That skill set is exactly what robots and artificial intelligence is already essentially perfect at. And so when that happened, I started to say, this seems like an interesting thing. So I started to kind of dive in, visit schools, meet people, interview people. And the first thing I did, do we think we can play this with any sound or not? Okay, well, I'll keep going. So I had seen, how many of you had seen the documentary Waiting for Superman? Okay, so how many saw it and liked it? Okay, see, I hated it, and I'll explain why. I hated it because of 2 things. One, I found the caricatures of teachers, even then, that was before I had done a lot of traveling, the cartoon drawings of the teachers in front of the room reading newspapers. I thought that was insulting. And I didn't think that was doing much to elevate a discussion about what we should do in education. And I thought even then that the notion that all you got to do is win the lottery, it was sort of like win the lottery, everything's great, don't win the lottery, you're totally hosed. I said life can't be that simple. And so I felt like it'd be really interesting and important contribution to do a documentary. And so I'm not a filmmaker, but I spent 6 months, I did a search for a director. Some of you, how many of you have seen Most Likely to Succeed? So I got this director who's just, I just love the guy. If you saw it and loved the film, and the film, I don't know if you know its history, but Sundance, AFI, Tribeca, 30 major film festivals. I'm the guy, people always complain about this, but I had my reasons, I think they were good reasons. I turned down Netflix. And I turned down Netflix because for the same reason I don't think anybody learns alone on a laptop, I don't think we would help schools make progress if people were watching a film alone at home on a laptop. And so we strictly supported community screenings. And we've done 5,000 community screenings around the world with this film. And it is changing schools and districts. So the film has been very effective in terms of making a contribution.
The Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
We are the premier engineering and science institution in the world.
Do you think you light a bulb with a battery and wire? Do you think you could light a bulb with a battery and wire?
Yeah.
light a bulb with a battery and a wire?
Maybe.
Yes,
All right.
definitely.
Do you think you can light a bulb with a battery and a wire?
Battery and wire? Well, yes, why not?
Okay.
Definitely.
Okay, can you do that?
The interesting part about the batteries and bulbs question is that people always predict that they can do it. Students say, of course I can do this.
Any hints I should have here?
Teachers say, of course my students can do this.
Ow! Do you know why that didn't work?
I have no idea.
Battery could be dead, the bulb could be bad, I'm hooking it up totally incorrectly. I'm not an electrical engineer, I'm a mechanical engineer. But if I had to guess, I would say it's operator error.
Okay.
I know it's possible, but I don't know how to do it.
It's only after failing that you begin to get upset with the question and think, well, maybe it's a trick question, maybe this has something to do with manipulating the wires. They couldn't hold all the wires together.
You don't have a current if you only have one wire. You need to complete a closed circuit.
But that's not the case.
Oh, well, if I do it with a little light bulb, I just do this. In which case, the light just lights up.
It goes to the fundamental understanding of electricity. If one cannot light a light bulb with a battery and wire, then everything built upon those basic ideas has problems.
So the reason I love this video, and it sort of gets back to that list of important, irrelevant, harmful, is I want you to think for a second about the academic performance of these students we just saw on the screen. So what do we know about kids graduating from MIT? Here's what we know for certain. 5 on AP Physics, 5 on AP Calculus BC, 800 on SATs, probably a 4.5 to 5.0, honors adjusted GPA, one of the 8 or 9% to get into MIT, graduating from 4 years from the most prestigious engineering institute in the country. Okay, and on graduation day, as professor there, he doesn't want me to use his name, is deeply skeptical that kids at MIT have learned any science and engineering. Now that is, I think it should shock some people that they might think that. But his view, his point, and I write about this in my book, and I write about it with a different physics person at Harvard up the river. But his point is that the way we teach electricity, the way we teach physics, but here's how, if we were all taking physics at MIT or Harvard, I would be the professor, and I would have my back to you, and I'd probably be writing on an electronic board and it would be blown up, but I'd be teaching you electricity by putting Coulomb's law on the board, right? We all remember Coulomb's law, just like we all remember exponential functions. And so I would put up there F equals a proportionality constant times Q1, Q2 over R squared, and you'd write that down, and I'd give you some homework problems where I give you 3 of the 4 parameters, and you'd have to compute the 4th, and then I wouldn't let you, if it's a hard school, I wouldn't let you bring the formula in. If it's not as hard school, you might be able to bring the formula in. And you would then get a problem yourself, and you'd have to compute the missing parameter. And we do a bunch of those. Maybe we then go to Kirchhoff's law and some other things. And that's the way we teach electricity. And that's the type of problem you see on the AP Physics exam. And yet, fast forward, 4 years later, these students can't light up a light bulb with a bulb, a wire, and a battery. And so the real question is, when you look at school, and this is what I really talk about, write about, advocate for, is that unless there's some connection between school and the real world, I'm not sure what's being accomplished with this process. And so I'll skip to this guy at Harvard, who's also quite interesting, but his name's Eric Mazur, and I've got a great section on him. But he also was convinced his students were learning a ton of science. He actually got Teacher of the Year award twice at Harvard. Think about the trajectory of kids studying physics at Harvard, right? Same trajectory. And he came across this thing called the force concept inventory, which is this really simple, I'm going to give you one of the 25 questions on the force concept inventory. And when I give you these questions, you say middle school science, right? So here it is. This is a real question. Airplane flying overhead, open up the cargo hatch, drop a heavy object. The trajectory is this, 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 okay? So, you say that, it doesn't get any easier. I mean, if you're in Harvard in a physics course, you're gonna get that one instantly. There's really no doubt about that. And so he gave his kids, beginning of the year, these 25 questions and expected them to be basically, if not perfect scores, close to perfect. And they were a net of 1/2 question better than guessing. And he was like, whoa. But he had a lot of confidence in his teaching ability. As I said, teacher of the year twice. A lot of confidence in how smart these students were. So he teaches the course the way he normally does. F equals proportionality constant Q1 times Q2 over R squared. But at the end, to see what happened, he gave them the same test. He didn't give them a variant of it. He gave them the exact same test he had given them at the beginning of the year. Now, you might think, maybe you wouldn't, but you might be tempted to think that kids curious about science who got questions like, what's a heavy object do when you drop it out of an airplane, might have talked to each other or looked it up or figured out something about it. But he gives them the exact same test at the end of the year, and there was really essentially no difference in, they're still basically guessing. And you think about that, and it's just like, whoa, that's so interesting. And so what Eric did, to his credit, is he completely revamped his course doesn't look at all like what it used to be. So it's like it's this strange combination of about 2/3 Socratic seminar and 1/3 what we call CTE, so actually make stuff work. And you go to I've been to his class several times, and you go to this class, and Eric says almost nothing. I mean, I've been to a 3-hour class, and Eric was talking for about 5 minutes. But what he does is airplane flying overhead, drops this, this, or this, gives students a few minutes to make up their own mind, and then puts them into small groups and they debate. And you watch these kids debate, and you could put people together in a cluster who all have the wrong answer, and after 20 minutes of debate, they have the right answer. Because they have to advance their reasons, and then somebody challenges them, and then they revise their reasons. And so you start to look at this and say, isn't it interesting, right, that if you draw kids into the process, if you're connecting the learning to the real world, because 1/3 of it is actually having to build things, make things. I mean, his kids in that class absolutely can light up the light bulb. What could happen in our sciences? The last point I make about Eric is that he was on the AP Physics Advisory Board for 5 years, and he begged them to use some of those questions. And they piloted him for 2 years, and they came back to him and said, we're not going to be able to use your questions. And he was disappointed, obviously, because he thinks his questions are really revealing and important. But I'd ask you, who can tell me the reason that they decided not to use his questions? Yeah, right here. Whoa. So it was a correlation. And they actually were, in some ways, anti-correlated, so they screwed up their distribution. You want a tiny number of 1s and 5s, a healthy number of 2s and 4s, and mostly 3s. And so when you start to push some kids that were scoring poorly on the formula stuff, they were doing better, and some kids that did well on the formula stuff back, they had this too many people were in the middle. And so instead of having to retool the entire test, so yes, so that's, do you work for ETS? No. So you start to look at, so what happened then? I'm going to skip over a couple things. Can I advance? I'm really nervous about these slides now, so bear with me. I'm going to skip through the trailer of the film. That's on the film's website. We got that? Oh, okay. Good. Okay, so I do this film, I start going places, and people start talking to me, and it's incredibly interesting. So if you haven't seen the film, we started at 12 different schools. We zeroed in on a couple students at a particular school, and we showed them working on collaborative projects. And these kids are so energized, they can't wait to get to school every day. And you look at this film, and it gives you a sense of what actually can happen in our schools. And people, though, would ask me a lot, great, but you say in the film, don't copy them. what should we do? What are things we can do? What's an example of great learning? And so I sort of at a certain point said, I think it's worth doing a road trip. And so I came up with this idea in July of 2015 of going to, it's an odd story, but I'll share it with you. I'm on the phone, a guy in North Dakota runs a venture capital initiative. And somebody connected him to me, and he asked me some questions about venture. You don't care about that. And he asked me, well, what are you interested in? I told him I'm really interested in the intersection of innovation and education. And I told him a little bit about the movie and the book I wrote with Tony Wagner. And in the middle, he happened to be the organizer of TEDx Fargo. And in the middle of the call, he said, oh my gosh, we just had a cancellation. Can you be here next Thursday to give a TEDx talk? And like 6 days to give a talk. And I wouldn't have gone except that for the 3 years before, 2013, 14, and 15, on my New Year's resolution list was go to North Dakota. Because I'd never been there. It's one state I hadn't been to, North Dakota. So I kind of said, okay, I'll come. And so I had 6 days to pull together a talk. That was fine. But as I thought about it, I said, well, it's going to be really interesting to go to, I might learn something. It might be really interesting. And so my talk actually said, okay, I'm going to every state. And so I took off. And I just said, I want to go to where the kids are. I want to go to schools all over the country. And so this is my map. And you can see this was a heck of a year. The other thing I did that was, you can either leave now and say this guy's nuts, but my director, Greg Whiteley, of the film Most Likely to Succeed, had done a documentary called Mitt, on Mitt Romney. And so I said, Greg, I'm going to do this, I'm taking this trip. And he said, you ought to talk to Romney's advanced campaign planning team, because they're really good at scheduling stuff. And I said, that sounds like a good idea. So I convinced them to help me. And so what that meant was I traveled every single day for every day of the school year for 9 months. They had me scheduled from 7:30 in the morning till 10:30 at night. And so, you name it. And I was like, well, where's Alaska? I mean, I spent 3 days in tribal villages in Alaska where there are no roads. I was on Indian reservation. I was in urban. I was in rural. I was just wherever there was stuff. And I wasn't really entirely sure what I was going to, it was like a bit of a who knows, right? It can't be that bad an idea, but I don't know how good an idea it would be. And what was so interesting, right? And Lonnie mentioned, so they were able to get me to a lot of governors. You don't learn that much from governors. A lot of state legislatures. Most of what you learn from a state legislator is not good. And I would go at them. A particular thing that I'm on the warpath on is, and I bet it's true here, but in most states you can't get a high school diploma unless you pass algebra. And I explained to them that only 15% of adults use algebra in their life. And yet when you look at how totally hosed a young adult is without a high school degree, how do you, and I'll say to them, I know all this, I'm able to say to legislators, what I did, I say, I'm just curious, when's the last time you solved simultaneous equations? Quadratic equation come up a lot. And the other thing I go after legislators on is the state mandated tests and their insistence on we have to measure things. And the thing I say I try to be polite, but I say to them that if you think test scores are so important, I think you should make your own SAT scores transparent. I actually believe it, right? If a kid can't graduate from high school over test scores, I write about fasten your seatbelt for this, but when I was in Florida, my jaw's dropping. There's a program, listen to this. This is what state legislators can do. There's a program in Florida, sounds good. The bad ideas in education all have the best names. So the Florida Best and Brightest program. And in Florida, they say, we're going to set aside, so some of it sounds like it might make sense. We're going to set aside bonus pools for our outstanding teachers. Well, I fight for better, I think teachers need a fair wage. I think that we're shortchanging everything in the process by not paying teachers, an adequate salary. So a $10,000 bonus. Now, of course, they're going to tie it to their students' test scores. I don't think that's a good idea. But that's not what's the dumb idea about the best and brightest. And you're going to say, when I tell you this, you're going to say this guy is just stepped on the stage from a Monty Python movie, but I didn't. So let's say you and I are all teachers in Florida, and somehow our students' test scores are good. We are now eligible, and I'm not making this up, $10,000 bonus. But to get that bonus, we have to retrieve our own SAT scores or ACT scores, and the only way we get that bonus is if we're in the top 20%. And if our own test scores, we could have taught sociology for 25 years and had a mediocre math score on our SAT, we don't get the $10,000 bonus. We can do test prep and retake the SAT. True. But absent being in the top 20%. And I just say, I say to him, okay, I think that's a really terrible idea, but surely you've made your test scores transparent. If that's what you're insisting teachers do, you should be willing to tell your constituents what your test scores are. And I said, unless, of course, you think being a legislator is that one area of life where test scores aren't important. And so you look at it, but what happened was, so I met with them, I met with a whole range, and I didn't meet with the superintendent of public instruction for public schools in Illinois, so I can't say there. I'd say half are really fighting hard and doing the right thing, and half are still sort of left over from No Child Left Behind. So that was sort of a mixed thing. But the thing that really amazed me, I'm going to grab some water, two things. One was I had the most interesting, fascinating, revealing discussions, often on my late night forums with parents. And parents a lot of them would want to talk to me about things. And not all, so bear with me. This is not saying all parents were like this, but this was a lot of the discussion that I had with parents. In the fall, they would come up and tell me how we're doing. We're taking 4 AP courses. We did a lot of test prep in the summer. We got a 720 and a 745 on our SATs, but we're going to take them again, and we think we can get those higher, and these are the extracurriculars we're doing. And then they'd ask for some advice about how to get into the colleges they want to get into. And then in the spring, a lot of times those parents they'd still talk about it the same way, but they'd say some variant of, we did everything right, but we didn't get into our top colleges. And I'd ask them, I don't try to pry, but I'd ask them, well, what colleges did you apply to? And they named some. And I'd say, it's interesting. I said, every single college that you mentioned, they only accept the student. You need to find a college that takes both of you, right? I mean, like if we are doing a great job, then we need to find a college that wants both of us. But I mean, the same thing, college president, these are the types of stories, and I know some of you are parents, but college presidents get calls from parents about grades. Employers tell me stories where, their kid gets turned down by an employer. Seniors in college get turned down by an employer, and the employer gets a call from the parent. One told me, a true story, they said that the student had an interview set up, and the parent called and said, my student can't make the interview, but would you mind if I come in and meet with you? I mean, it's really true. It's an amazing thing. But here's what I want to get to, which really surprised me the most, was I never got tired on this trip. I mean, this should be really, it should have been pretty exhausting, and I'm not the youngest guy in the room. But I just sort of drew daily inspiration from the teachers. And I have no axe in this, right? I mean, I just kind of went with where I went, took the information I got, met with people. And it's not to say every teacher was astounding and excellent, and I observed a lot of classrooms, but they were so dedicated and passionate that it's just like, oh my gosh, and one of the things that stood out on that trip was I didn't even really necessarily plan to go there. I had to go from Topeka to Oklahoma City, so I was just driving through Kansas. That's a long drive. And in the middle of nowhere in Kansas, I see this billboard in Emporia for the National Teachers Hall of Fame. I mean, it is really, really in the middle of nowhere. And I just said, I got to go there, And so I pull off and I wind around and I find it. And the woman that runs it is a past inductee. It turns out it's really hard to get into the national so they only take 5 a year. You have to have taught for at least 20 years. And these are teachers that just have changed lives in the most profound way. But and they just had kind of a room with some mementos and some, just things you might expect with things about these teachers and what they did. But up on a hill, they have a little chapel, and they have these tombstones and memorials to teachers who have given their lives for students. And there are a lot of them, and there are more, since I was there, more, obviously. And it was just like, it struck me that it was just it's so painful to observe a world where we trust the lives of our children with teachers, but we don't trust them with lesson plans. And one of the teachers I met along the way that I write about was this guy, an inductee in Michigan named Gary Koppelman. And he got up, we did a community forum together, and he got up in front of a room with mostly younger people wanting to go into education. And he said, every day I get up and I have to ask myself the question, do I do what the state tells me to do, or do I do what I think is going to really help my kids? And it's like, I sense that anguish as I traveled. And so when I talk about the Harvard kids or the MIT kids that I think have really learned very little, it's not a criticism of teachers. It's a criticism of the measures we use to judge academic success. And when we put an enormous amount of weight on SATs or AP scores, or we deprive kids from diplomas over state-mandated tests, I encourage people to go look at those test questions and ask yourself, do they get at something really important in life? Because I think you'll find, if you look at them, you'll say no. They're not consequential in life. They test agility of mind, they test rapidity, they reward drilling. SAT tutors all the time tell me that their coaching, their advice to students is, if the problem is hard and you're going to have to spend time on it, skip it. And I feel like that's the worst possible message you could give to a student. If it's hard and you got to figure it out, skip it. But that's sort of the world we live in. And so when I got done with that, I didn't, when I started the trip, think I'd write a book. But by the time I got done, I just seen in the most unlikely places these incredible things.
Attention passengers traveling on United Airlines Flight 687 to Chicago. Please proceed to gate 61. Your flight is now boarding.
So I saw these things, and what was interesting and what was hard in writing the book was the stuff that blew me away. At first I said there's no rhyme or reason. It was all so different. And so I talk about kids in Fort Wayne, Indiana, kindergarten kids designing robots, or third graders in rural West Virginia that man the IT support function for their school, or eighth graders in Fargo, North Dakota, making their own documentaries capturing the history of their community, or kids, high school kids that normally were never going to graduate in Albuquerque, New Mexico, designing and implementing social media campaigns for the local soccer team. And all these different things. And it was very difficult in some ways initially to think about how these all fit together, because it's sort of the antithesis of standardized. It's anti-standardized education. It was the passions of the teacher and the interests of the kids doing these things where they were working together. But the thing is, it's like, and you know it, right, is that, and I am an avowed anti-data guy when it comes to school, because I say if you want to know what's working, get out of your get out of your office and go visit these schools, because as soon as you went into them, you knew I mean, the kids were running around. You just knew they were loving it. You couldn't, go in these classrooms, I couldn't even find the teacher initially. They were off to the side. They were doing something different. And I interviewed a lot of these kids. And so there's kind of a lot of schools, and I interview kids, and I'll say, what are you working on? And a lot of times they don't know. And why are you working on it? And they'll say, it's my assignment, or whatever. I'll go to some schools that are, highly regarded, high schools. I've been to most of the top 20, if you did your list of elite private high schools or most expensive private high schools, I'll go to those schools and I ask the students, I'm just curious, what are you interested in? I swear to God, these kids will say to me, I'm really interested in Brown, but I'm also thinking about Bowdoin and Colby. I'll say, I didn't really ask that. And yet you go to these other places, and these kids just, when you ask them what they're working on, they always started with something interesting. I'm really curious about something, so I'm doing this. We're trying to design something, so we're doing this. We're working to make a real change in our community, so we're doing this. And so I sort of stepped back from that experience, which was like drinking out of a fire hose, to say the least, and said, what did these things have in common? And so I really distilled it down to, the acronym I came up with, just to keep it straight in my own mind, was PEAK. But if I go from reverse order, I feel like we are far too optimistic that our kids have actually learned this stuff we think they're learning. And I showed you the MIT kids. But in this book and in the movie, I talk about a different school, Lawrenceville Academy. If you're on the East Coast and your kid gets into Lawrenceville, your ship has come in. It's a boarding school, so high school costs $65,000, feeds the Ivy League. What Lawrenceville did that I thought was bold and interesting is they decided to retest their kids. So you take your final in June, and they said, we're going to retest them when they come back in September to see how much they retained. And some of the faculty said, wait, hold on. There's some questions on the final that they wouldn't really remember over the course, they'll forget over the course of the summer. Which is sort of like, in some ways, like, should that type of question be on a final? But then the administration said, well, get rid of those questions. Just ask these kids the fundamental things you're sure they all learned in your course. So that's what they retested them on. The average grade went June B+, September F, 2 years, lots of subjects, lots of kids. Not one kid retained everything that the faculty was sure every kid retained. And so, yet, what do we know? I mean, I'll ask you to think about, how do you know you've really learned something? How can you tell somebody's really learned something? And what I saw in these places that I was so impressed with was they would have kids teach other kids. And we all know that, anybody who's an educator knows you never learn anything as well as when you teach somebody. They applied it. They put a real weight on the questions a kid asked about something instead of just their answers. And so they had really thought carefully about, how do you know somebody knows? The second thing is, which I think there's this irony, right? If we looked at kindergarten kids have a fair amount of discretion over what they spend their time on. By the time most kids get to high school, easily 100%, often more, of their waking hours are already pre-programmed. We have taken every bit of agency out of our kids in high school. Here's what's problem with that, back to where the jobs are going to come from. Apple Computer recently said, we've decided any employee that needs a boss is no longer employable. The world wants people that can manage their own efforts, but we don't really foster that through schools. There are a lot of places that don't. The third is these places were really clear on what skill sets and mindsets they wanted their kids to develop. And it's a great exercise for any school community to do. EdLeader 21, I'm a fan of that organization. They have an online thing called Portrait of a Graduate that helps you with that. And you just sort of say, what do we want our kids to get good at? And people always come up with the same answer, creative problem solving or collaboration or communication. But that sort of is a North Star that guides what's going on in the classrooms. The one that means the most to me, and I haven't spent time here, but this is what I've observed broadly, is what we often do with kids is we tell them from a fairly early age to do things because it's going to look good to somebody else. In our film, for those of you who seem most likely to succeed, we show a 4th grader And it's a parent-teacher conference, and the fourth grader's in the room in tears saying nothing. And the mother is saying to the teacher she doesn't find this very relevant or interesting. And the teacher's saying back, well, that's going to help her build grit. It's like that's what we do with bad curriculum is we say it builds, there's no point to it and you don't see why it's useful, so it'll help you build grit. And, and what happens, and what I see happen way too often is that that's about when we weigh in on kids. And I would have done this with my own kids. I probably did do it to some extent. Where you just say, you got to do it. If you don't do this, you won't get into the right college. And if you don't get into the right college, you won't have a good life. And that's our best weapon to get kids to take this seriously. And in the process, two things happen, right? One is, with most likely to succeed, this is an extreme example, but you need to hear it. The first community screening I did with most likely to succeed was at a high school in California. And they said, we think we'll have a big audience. I said, well, how big? And they said, well, our auditorium holds 850, and it wouldn't surprise us if it's full. So the film had not even been really out. I said, that's kind of interesting. And I got there, and they said, we have had to change a game plan. We're doing it in the auditorium, but we're streaming it to the gym. They had 850. Every seat in the auditorium was full. 650 seats in the gym were full. 1,500 people for a community screening of that film. Why? That school had had 5 student suicides that year. And they happened when SATs came back, they happened when early decision letters came back, and they happened when acceptance letters came back. And what happens is, unfortunately, is that these kids are hearing from us. And I always tell parents, adults, and I'm going to tell you this as well. The best thing you can do for a kid who's a junior in high school is not ask them a thing about college. And really, I'm going to just double emphasize it. Do not ask a kid anything about college. They are hearing it from a million other people. The pressure's enormous. Their classmates know about it. The last thing they need is well-intentioned adults piling on. And I say to kids, tell them you're going to take a gap year. I think you should, but I say if somebody asks you about college plans, just say, I'm pretty serious about taking a gap year. But what happens is that we say, if you don't go to A, B, and C, you won't have a great life. It's incredibly competitive to get into A, B, and C. They get into X, Y, or Z, and they feel like they didn't do well. That's not so good. But the other thing is, right, that if you're telling kids from an early age, do things to look good to a college admissions officer, do things to look good to, do things to please some anonymous stranger, they listen, right? That shapes the person they become. And the graduation speaker can't change that. You can give a great graduation speech about going out and making the world better. And so when I went to these places, and the places I write about, the kids were encouraged. They were getting really good at identifying ways they could make their world better. And it could be in all sorts of different ways. It could be writing a play. It could be writing hip hop. It could be composing music. It could be starting a nonprofit initiative. But they were connecting their learning to tangible ways that the student had led and identified that made a positive impact on their world. And they were learning an enormous amount from that. And so you start to realize that, and what I say is, there are no surprises in what we should be doing with our kids. We know what works. We know what the kids can't wait to do, and I describe a bunch. But you know as well. We know what gets these kids feeling really fired up about being in school. We know if we trust our teachers, they want to do that desperately, and they will do that. And then it's just this question of the metrics, the measures, the definitions of success that oftentimes are grossly at odds with what's going to be helpful in bringing up a healthy young kid. And so I write about, I'm a supporter of the Coalition for Access. It's one of the things I'd say as a call to action is tell your college you're not going to give them another penny until they change their admissions procedure, right? There are 130 colleges in the Coalition for Access. In theory, it supports digital portfolios. I'm donate to them. I gave the keynote 2 years ago. I'm giving the keynote this summer. Last year, out of 133, looked at digital portfolios. And I say to the college, I'll say it again this summer, spend less money marketing, less money on brochures, trying to get more people to apply you're going to turn down, and spend a little bit more time looking at authentic work. But I think if we can start to get that balance, and then the relieving, I think the the best and most encouraging point I make to parents is that the whole college thing is a crapshoot. You really have no idea. Like we did everything right and we didn't get in. And an awful lot of colleges actually are looking for signs that it's an interesting kid. And so when you're going to bring up your kid as a parent, you're going to teach your kid as a teacher, you can either say, we really want you to look good to college admissions based on what we think is going to look good, or we can really focus on having this kid be really doing the things they're motivated to do and becoming a really interesting young adult. And some admissions officers might want this and some might want this, but this is going to be a lot happier kid and it's going to be a lot better relationship all around. So anyway, I hope you'll check out the book. I feel like, as I say, I feel deeply in the gratitude of teachers. I think they do amazing things, and I think that too often business people don't support what's going on in our classrooms. And so I've been really excited to sort of get out there and talk a lot about the great work that is going on. And it's there, and I'm sure it's here. I mean, it's just that we need to do more of it. So anyway, on that, I'd love to take any questions, or I won't try showing another video. But you've been a great audience, so.